Right, okay. And we're not going to take much longer because we don't have that many questions, really. I mean, after this one, I think we have
Okay. Yeah, let's get
just three more. That's okay.
So I think the answer we were talking about the obtaining the Orthodox ethos in the midst of heterodoxy and all the influences there. And so that if you don't have examples, it's true, it's very difficult. You have to have examples. One of the hardest part for everybody outside of a traditional Orthodox country, the hardest part about becoming Orthodox is obtaining the Orthodox ethos. And you see that in America. You'll talk to very zealous Orthodox Christians, and yet what many times you'll see that they're still very much a part of the culture and the way of Christianity that they learned in Protestantism. And there's just things that are glaringly different in the lives of the saints, in the life of the church. So it's not, they don't have a lot of examples. They're in convert parishes. They don't see the incarnation of the way of Christ so readily. And so it's hard for them to understand that, well, the way that they're dealing with this or talking about that is really not consistent with the Orthodox stance. So what do? Well, we can't bring Mount Athos over. So what are we going to do? We're going to read every day and with much piety and pain of heart the lives of the saints. That's number one. Number two, and number three. Read the lives of the saints daily. Read the lives of the saints daily. Read the lives of the saints daily. And that doesn't mean just the 5 paragraphs, but to read the extended tomes of contemporary saints, St. Paisius of the Holy Mountain, and get to know them and call upon them. Get to know at least a few saints and have them as your friends who you love dearly and you speak to and you ask for help. Pray the supplication service to the saints. That's a very wonderful way to get to know them and come to be in communion with them and love them. Have them translated into Portuguese. Read them, even if in English, just read them. But those are written with much piety and much love, much devotion. That's the kind of relationship we have to have with the saints. The saints themselves had relationships like that with the saints. And that's how they imitated them and therefore Christ, because Christ lives in all of the saints and they are all little Christs. So we have to be friends of the saints to acquire what they had, which is the Orthodox ethos, and to put aside the old way, the old man, which is the way of the world, which is at war with the way of Christ.
Next one is by Leonardo da Silva. Okay, what do the fathers of the church say about the risks of academic theology or of theologizing as a purely intellectual exercise?
Okay, so this is an important question because this is one of the major problems we have in the church today. And let me just say it very clearly so everyone understands. The demons, according to the Apostle James, tremble and believe. Many academic theologians are worse than the demons. In other words, they don't tremble and they don't believe. To be an academic theologian is not at all like to be a true theologian. A true theologian, first of all, is one who's been purified through asceticism, through much prayer and fasting, through humility and obedience and submission to the church. An academic theologian could have none of that and be respected and be published and all the rest. Academic theology, the approach, in other words, to God and his revelation and his continued presence in the world, in the church, that approach that has none of the presuppositions that we're talking about is extremely dangerous and a threat to the church when bishops present those people as authorities in the church. This is exactly what happened in Vatican II. Such academic theologians were the authorities in drafting the text and presenting the new ecclesiology, the new teachings of Vatican II. And in some ways, Crete, the council that happened in Crete, imitated Vatican II in many ways. So it's a major problem. And that's why, again and again and again, you will hear me say, read the lives of the saints, run to the saints, be friends of the saints, and follow the saints. You don't hear me ever say, or you don't hear any of the saints say, read academic theologians, study academic theologians, immerse yourself in academic theology. Now, can one be a pious person and do academic theology? Of course. Is that the majority? No. It's a small minority in reality because of the nature of the beast of academic theology. There are examples of pious men who were academic theologians, but they're all, for the most part, not all, but for the most part, they were opposed. Father George Pulowski was notable, Father John Romanides. So rationalism, a rationalistic approach to God, which is acceptable in academic theology, is the basis, the ground for heresy. Speculative theology, again, this idea, this philosophical approach to theology, a true theologian does not speculate about God. He has experience of God. Speculative theology does not produce theologians, but heresy. True knowledge of God, again and again, is referred to by St. Paul as epignosis. Epignosis in Greek, which means hands-on knowledge. Like St. John the theologian said, we touched him, we saw him, we heard him. He's the great theologian, St. John the theologian, because he had experience, he had personal relationship, he spoke from experience. This was epignosis, hands-on experiential knowledge. This is the kind of knowledge we have to obtain. And this only comes through the ascetic, hesychastic, narrow life of the church. And you can be an academic theologian and be respected and not have any of that.
All right, the next one. Oh, the next one is actually several by the same guy, but so we're at the end. Okay, all by Ricardo Ribeiro. Okay, so Ricardo asks, how do the Orthodox identify an ecumenical council?
We
How
take
can we identify?
at a time, one question at a time. There's like 15 questions, so maybe we should take time, because if you ask them all, then
all right, okay. So the first one is about ecumenical councils. How we identify them, and how we identify what in the tradition of the church has ecumenical value of authority after the Great Schism. Be it ecumenical councils of church magisterium or else. Roman Catholics often accuse us of not being able to do any of these.
All right, so I'm not going to give a long academic answer, to the question of how do Orthodox identify an ecumenical council, but I will point him to a very good source that actually has just addressed this very thoroughly online. If he goes to a website called Ubi Petras, and title, I can bring it up actually, the title of the Ubi Petras Ecclesia.com or whatever, what makes a council ecumenical? There's a two-part answer, and you can go online and find that. What makes a council ecumenical? Okay, in two words, what makes a council ecumenical is the consensus of all the local patriarchs and churches. That's what's happened throughout history. And unanimous consent, let's say, is not a literal 100%, because there's always going to be some detractors. That's why ecumenical councils are called, is because we have a controversy, and usually some walk away dissatisfied and they leave the church, they're anathematized. So unanimity or unanimousness on the part of the church does not mean 100%. It means that the local churches in the persons of the patriarchs, because they're representing not themselves, but all of the bishops with them, have embraced the faith. So that's on a horizontal level, a spatial level. But diachronically, it also means that you're following the Holy Fathers. So it's a cross again, both in history and in time and space. You have agreement. Now, that's one simple answer. But obviously, throughout church history, those who stand apart from the church will disagree with the church. Of course, heretics will leave the church, will accuse the church. And what I find very interesting in the papal Protestant, Latin, Roman Catholic approach to this question is that it's very legalistic, and it shows an aspect of what they hold so dear, and that is the sense of security that they think they have in the papacy. But actually, their argument is quite circular. And so, quite to the opposite, from the Orthodox perspective, they have no security because they put all their eggs in one basket, and that is one bishop in one city. And that was never, ever the life of the church in the ancient church. Anybody who has any real knowledge and experience of looking at the sources and the events of church history, especially surrounding the ecumenical councils, will see that we have popes who were dismissed and defrocked and anathematized by ecumenical councils, including what I just talked about in a lecture I gave just a couple of days ago, the Eighth Ecumenical Council under St. Photios, who anathematized Pope Nicholas. So it's a long answer, but I think what's interesting is behind this question is that they find great security in the papacy, but we actually see it as the lack of security, the latching on to a institution that was created long after the schism, or after the schism and was developed and then codified long after the schism. And it shows actually a lack of security. In the church, we have great security in the Holy Spirit. And we, like in a family, the family doesn't go around telling people outside the family why the family made the decision it made and how it came to that decision and on what basis, and has to give an apology to the people outside the family. People don't expect that of a family. The mother, the father, the children, they have their way. They understand their way. They pass it on to their grandchildren and all the rest. So it's the whole approach is I find it very rationalistic and legalistic, and it's a debate and an argumentative approach to the church, which is characteristic of a legalistic understanding of the church. There's so much to unpack, but that's what I would say in 2 minutes here.
Okay. Okay, next.
Let me add two things. He asked about the second millennium, and we have the Eighth Ecumenical Council under Photios. We have the Ninth Ecumenical Council of St. Gregory Palamas. We have other ecumenical councils which were seen as that but never declared, like the one that overturned Florence. We have councils. I've talked about this in other places. So I don't know. The question is, how do we determine, or how do we identify what the saints identify it? The saints commemorate it. The Holy Fathers commemorate it. It's that people are very ignorant of this tradition, though, in the West, and we don't talk about it because we don't feel the need to talk about it very much. But there are many councils that have happened. In fact, the church has councils continually, but they don't gain a status of ecumenical, but they have been received by the conscience of the church. So
okay.
I don't know if you need to translate that, but I wanted to make sure I answered the full question there.
All right. Okay. So the next one is, how do you see the current rupture between the Russian Church and Constantinople? And what do you think the most likely outcome will be?
I think it has been provoked for the most part, but not entirely, but for the most part. And decisively.
It's what? Sorry? I didn't get the word.
I think it has been provoked for the most part, but decisively provoked by Constantinople, and is the fruit of an alienation from the Orthodox ecclesiology and a slow but very very problematic and painful for the church assimilation of a papal vision of the church. And that's what's really at stake. It's not just the question of Ukraine per se, which of course is a great injustice and a division among the faithful in the Ukraine, unilateral, without the blessing of the local churches and all the rest. But the real problem is that there's a rise in papalism and an alienation from Orthodox ecclesiology. It's become very apparent in Constantinople. How will it end? I think it will be overcome by God's grace, and we'll have a return to Orthodox ecclesiology, but it will be very painful. And it might take several years, and it will be, of course, God's intervention that will overcome it. But it will be very painful for the church, because when heresy and delusion arises, one has to, for it to leave, there has to be suffering on the part of the faithful.
All right, two more. How can we, the lay people, do something to contribute to evangelization and a solid Orthodox formation in our parishes and in our states? How does a lay person live a Christian life in the world, at work, and in the family?
So I think the first one we pretty much answered. I think you should go back and look at the previous questions and answers. We've talked about the question of evangelization and formation and all the rest. So the second one, we partly answered as well, but I'll say the following. To live a Christian life in the world, work, and family presupposes that we've been formed and initiated and live internally the life in Christ. So I think that it shines forth when one has been purified through asceticism, through fasting, and through imitation of the saints. That means we know the saints, we read the lives of the saints, we're participating in the mysteries, we're praying the Jesus prayer. And then what happens is that we have a dynamic relationship with the Spirit of God, and we acquire experience and discernment, so that when we encounter in the work, in the family, in the world, we encounter all of the various challenges, the various attacks. It's not a rational reflection per se. It's not fruit of some kind of book knowledge of how we're going to live in those circumstances, but it is the Spirit of God and the prayer that's bubbling within us that illumines us. And the Lord says as much in the gospel. He says, don't premeditate when you're talking about, of course, confession before the people and the confession of his name, but same thing applies to all challenges. Don't premeditate. Don't sit there and think, what do I say? But I will give you a mouth, a word that will be unbeatable, unstoppable, so to speak. And so that points to the fact that if we don't have him in us, we won't be able to deal with all these varied and difficult and different situations. So he says somewhere in the gospel, when you confess, and it's translated usually as, when you confess me before men, I will confess you before the Father in heaven. But the Greek says, when you confess in me. When you confess in me. And that doesn't mean just with the words, you confess me. It means that you live in him, like St. Paul says, Christ lives in me and I in him. And it's not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So that confession of faith in the world, the work, and the family, dealing with being a Christian, that's what confession of faith means, right? Both in word and deed, giving the witness of a Christian presupposes that dwelling within. You can't confess if he's not in you. Even if you do say the right words, he doesn't show forth in you. So it's not convincing. So again, we come back again and again to the internal life of the Christian, and that means the Jesus prayer. It means constant remembrance of God. It means having been purified and keeping the commandments. So once we do that, then we can navigate life. Without that, we're going to be searching and always backpedaling and looking for answers frantically, and oftentimes we will not beat the passion and the demonic provocation. We won't make it in time. We'll be beaten first because it's not on that level. When you work on yourself deep in the cell, your little prayer closet, then the fruit of that is shown forth in the daily life. When that is absent, the daily life, you can't make it. You can't win. So you've got to go into the prayer closet. You've got to pray. When he says when you pray, it doesn't say if you pray, when you pray, alone, far from the eyes of men, there, and that means the Jesus prayer, and that means having him dwell within you and having the remembrance of God constantly. Then you don't have to ask your spiritual father every time for everything, because the Spirit of God goes in you and informs you. Over time, it's a process, but that's the goal.
All right. The last one.
Okay.
Is there any difference between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic devotions to the Theotokos? It's very common here. I mean, people try to find, here's where we have common ground.
There's actually a great book on this by St. John of Shanghai in San Francisco on the whole veneration of the Mother of God, and he has a whole chapter on the problem in Catholicism with regard to the veneration of the Mother of God. And of course, it's a very basic and important problem. And I would add there's two actually major problems with veneration in Catholicism from an Orthodox perspective. The first is the idea of an immaculate conception of the Mother of God in the womb of her mother, Saint Anna. In other words, that she was conceived without any sin. And from the conception on, there was no sin in the Mother of God. And what's the problem with this? Well, it makes her the great exception and not the great rule, not the great example, in other words. In other words, it steals from her all of her virtue. It steals from her all of her greatness, because the greatness of the Mother of God was that, like us, and yet without any personal sin. Not that she didn't have and share in the results of the fall, in the sense that she was born into this fallen world. If she was not born into this fallen world, then the flesh that she took on was not our flesh, and therefore he didn't redeem us. She's something different than us. She's in another category. And the problem with this is that it goes back to the problem with the Orthodox understanding of original or ancestral sin. So it's a very complex, multifaceted problem that's presented in Latin theology. In their desire to exalt her, they actually have robbed her of her greatness. And that again is because if she was born without sin and she could not sin, and that was basically not ever a problem, not a struggle, well, the great virtue of a saint is that there was a struggle, and they were victorious. There was synergy, and they did not work with the demons, but they cooperated with the grace of God, and they achieved to perfection in that, to theosis. From our standpoint, there's many problems, sociological problems in terms of the doctrine of the fall, and then in this day and age, they've arrived at the point where there's many theologians in Catholicism that want to see her proclaimed as co-redemptrix. They want to see her as co-redemptrix, in other words, a co-redeemer on the level of the Redeemer. Now, I'm not very well versed in that, so I don't want to speak too much about it, but the little I know is it's not acceptable to an Orthodox. We would never do that. Again, it's an error of maybe a great piety for the Mother of God, but undiscerning. So it's a zeal not according to knowledge. And we exalt the Mother of God, I would say, more than anyone on the face of the earth, but properly, rightly, and with knowledge. And that doesn't seem to be present in the contemporary Catholicism. So I would recommend the person go and read St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco's book, and the whole chapter dedicated to the Mother of God, and particularly the problem with Catholicism and their veneration of the Mother of God today.
All right. Okay. Well, Father, thank you so much. It was a marathon.
Well, there's a lot of questions. It took us longer than we thought, but thank God. Hopefully it'll help many. When you do this, when you cut it back, are you going to cut out the double answers? Are you going to be able to like edit it so it's just me and you talking with the subtitles? Or how will you do it?
Yeah, I don't know, because the boys who are going to do this will also participate in the management of this page, of this Instagram page. I'll talk to them and we will see which is better. I think it makes more sense to cut the Portuguese parts, because then it becomes shorter.
Okay.
But we will see how it can be done.
Keep me posted, and
All right.
help the faithful there. God bless you. Good struggles to you. Good Lent to you. Good Pascha. God bless.
Okay. Amen. Thank you so much, Father.
Thank you.
It was a great joy to have you with us, and I hope that in the future we can have other meetings like this.
Amen. Let it be blessed.
Amen.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.